arrived at the site, the inspector was pleased to see that 2 of the Firestone officers were chatting to some locals at the police tape, and that the soldiers had already begun work on the trees. He nodded at the officers at the tape, who nodded respectfully back. "Would you mind checking on your colleagues while I chat with the Major?" the inspector asked Drew. "Of course not," Drew replied cheerfully, and made his way over to them. The inspector made directly for Major Shepherd, who was talking to some of his men as they tackled a large tree trunk. "Morning, Major," the inspector called. "Ah, morning, Inspector. Well, what do you think now you can see it in the daylight?" the Major asked. "Well, I surely have to commend you and your men on their efforts. This is an amazing feat." "Good. Pleased you are pleased," the Major smiled, proud of his men. "Still more work to do this morning. It's the oddest thing." "What is?" the inspector asked. "Well, this morning, when we arrived, the path was, or seemed, narrower. It's the damnedest thing, as though the trees on the edge had grown back overnight." "Well, that is odd," the inspector agreed. "I trust we still have enough space for the digger to fit through." "Oh yes, plenty of room for that," the Major reassured him. "Wonderful." The inspector removed his camera from his briefcase and began taking pictures. The path through the trees was very definite, made more so by the density of the trees along its borders. The men had done extremely well. The Major looked about the newly created path as the camera's click echoed around them. "I shall just brief the men quickly before the digger arrives," he informed the Major as he put the camera away. The Major nodded and the inspector cleared his throat. "Could I have your attention, please?" he called to them, and they all turned to listen. "In a moment the digger will arrive, during which time it won't be easy for us to work around the mound, so if I could ask you to split into 2 teams again, with Drew in the bus to begin clearing another path through the trees, and the other will remain here to assist the digger." As he spoke, a large flatbed truck arrived with the digger riding piggyback on it. It pulled up on the side of the road in the space the soldiers had cleared at the entrance to the path. "Well, looks like your digger's arrived and we can start getting some of that mud shifted," the Major informed him. The inspector turned. "Marvellous," he enthused. "That will be all for now, men. Please get yourself into your teams," he requested nicely. "Major, could you locate the private trained to drive it and send him over to the truck for me?" "Of course, Inspector, no problem." The Major began searching the men for the driver while they began arranging themselves into their teams. The inspector arrived at the truck. "Morning," he called up to the driver's cab. "Morning," the driver replied. He opened his door and climbed down, revealing a short man in grubby, oil-stained dark blue overalls. "I take it you're the inspector I'm supposed to find, then?" he asked in a broad northern accent. "Yes, that's me. Everything all right? Are we ready to go?" the inspector asked. "Yes, sir, it's all yours. I'm supposed to stick around, help you move some earth you've got, is that right?" "Yes, that would be much appreciated. One of the chaps here is going to move the digger. Ah, here he is now." The Major approached them with a young man in his 20s. "This is Private Jensen, Inspector. He's going to get this digger going for you," the Major explained. "Wonderful. Well, Private, I'm presuming you can guess what I want you to do?" "Yes, Inspector. You want me to shift all that mud onto the back of this truck?" Jensen replied intuitively. "Indeed. As carefully as you can, as we have no idea what is hidden under there. May I suggest you get the digger down and drive it up to the mound while—" "Sorry, what was your name?" the inspector asked the truck driver. "John," he answered simply. "Well, John, reverses the truck up the path so you can begin loading it with soil," the inspector informed Private Jensen. "Yes, sir," Jensen replied, and he and John began freeing the digger. Within a few minutes the hoists were loose, and John lowered a ramp from the truck for the digger to drive down. A small cry for joy went up from the soldiers and the small gathering crowd when the digger's engine erupted into life. Jensen carefully drove the digger down the ramp and up the path through the trees, its tracks making short work of the rough terrain. The inspector followed Jensen's careful driving, arriving at the mound just behind him and his digger. "Now, if you could start to carefully remove the soil from here," the inspector called over the din of the engine, indicating a side of the mound close to the path through the trees, "and slowly make your way round the edge, I'd appreciate it. Careful being the operative word here, Private." "Understood, Inspector," Jensen called back, and he began to carefully tease the soil into the scoop at the end of the digger's long arm. The men had all stopped their preparations and hiked up the path to watch, breath bated, as the first scoop of earth was picked up. The digger's arm was carefully pushed into the soil, causing avalanches to cascade down to the ground. The truck slowly approached, getting as close as it could on the rough, broken ground before the first scoop of soil was dumped unceremoniously onto the back. Jensen continued to carefully lift more mud from the mound while the men split into their groups. They all stood and watched the digger at work for a few minutes before half of the men drifted down to the coach, ready for their next assignment. "I'll be off then," Drew announced once the digger was well underway. "Yes, thank you, Drew. Shall we reconvene at the Green Man at 1 o'clock for lunch?" the inspector suggested. "Sounds good. See you then," Drew agreed, and hurried to the coach, which pulled out and went on its way. After 30 minutes of careful digging, it was clear that the digger was having much greater effect on the mound than the men could. As they watched, mesmerised by it, a car arrived unnoticed by the side of the road. Its lone occupant approached one of the officers at the entrance to the path, who escorted him to the inspector. "Excuse me, Inspector," he called over the sound of the digger as he approached. Yes, Constable, the inspector asked, clicking away with his camera at its progress through the mud. There's a man here to see you. Says he's from the museum in Telford. Says you asked for him. The constable replied with a shiver against the cold. Oh, yes, our archaeologist has arrived. The inspector tore himself away from the digger to welcome his guest. Good morning, thank you so much for coming. The inspector and the archaeologist shook hands. My pleasure, Dr. Sampson at your service. My word, what have you found here? He asked immediately. Dr. Sampson was well dressed in tweed trousers with high green Wellingtons and a well-worn waxed jacket. He was greying with small spectacles over his keen black eyes. He wore a flat cap and looked every part like the archaeologist. It's an earth mound, I would say approximately 700 years old. I doubt if it is a ritual burial mound. There are no entrances as you might expect. I suspect it could contain remains, but I think its purpose is actually to hide something else, the inspector informed him. What? Sampson asked, intrigued, and a little impressed at his knowledge. That I am not sure of, the inspector replied honestly. What I think you would find interesting for the moment is on the back of that truck. The inspector motioned toward the gradually heightening pile of earth. A couple of soldiers had jumped on the back of the truck and were beginning to spread the soil around to even out the weight. The soil from the mound? Sampson asked excitedly. There could be anything in there, he realised. Indeed, the inspector agreed. I hoped that perhaps you could do me a favour and sort through it to see what, if anything, is in there. Well, yes, of course. I only bought myself, though. I need some help from the museum. Sampson began to redden with excitement. Of course, please, as many heads as you think you need, the inspector agreed. You do realise that by destroying the mound like this, you could be compromising hidden artefacts, he asked, a little aghast. A necessary risk, I'm afraid, Doctor. It is part of an ongoing investigation into a body that was discovered here a few days ago, he explained. Whatever is hidden in it holds a vital clue to the body's appearance, and it is paramount I discover what it is as soon as possible. Sampson nodded distractedly and dropped the subject. I need to get to a telephone and make some calls, he informed the inspector excitedly. There is a lot of soil here. I will need some help. He glanced about him constantly at the movement around the site. The inspector sensed his urgency. Of course, if you head across the road to the church, you will find in the vicarage a very kind gentleman by the name of Aldous. If you tell him I sent you, who you are, and that you need to use his telephone, I'm sure he will be pleased to oblige you. Dr. Sampson nodded. Yes, I saw it on the way here, just over the road. Thank you, I won't be long. He hurried off back to his car, and the inspector returned his attention expectantly to the mound. The truck was soon at capacity, and Jensen stopped digging and switched the digger's engines off. Truck's full, he called as he climbed out of the cab. Although the mound was visibly shrinking, it was obvious that the task was taking a considerable effort. It was not as low as the pile in the truck suggested it should be. Well done, Private. Very good work, the inspector thanked Jensen. Have a break for a while. You've earned it. I might be a while. When you're ready to start again, leave the soil you remove here. The inspector pointed to a spot near where he stood, with a pointed finger. We can load it into the truck on our return. Jensen nodded and lit a cigarette gratefully. The Major approached. Where's all this going then? He asked. There's a site on the other side of Firestone. I believe it is where the soil was taken from in the first place. We are putting it back. The Major nodded. Right you are. See you soon, he said, and busied himself with his men. Wonderful. Now, John. He turned to the small man in the blue overalls who sat in the truck's cab keeping warm. Yes, Inspector, John answered. Shall we get rid of this soil? The inspector suggested. John nodded. Right you are, jump in, he called down, and the inspector made his way round to the passenger's side and climbed in next to him. They were quickly off, John making his way carefully out onto the road. The small crowd had become a little smaller, no doubt due to the persistent cold spit that fell sadistically from the sky. The path we're going to is quite narrow. You'll have to reverse up it. Do you think that will be manageable? The inspector asked. Depends how narrow, John pointed out, unabashed. Good point. By my estimations, you should have a foot gap or so each side, the inspector informed him. That should be fine. Squeezed it in tighter places, believe me, he informed him, with a rasping cough of a laugh. Good. Right here, the inspector informed him, and he took a right turn out of the town, and in a few short minutes they had arrived at the path to the clearing. A large pile of cut wood had already appeared at the side of the road, making it obvious for John to see where he was expected to go. He gave 2 quick blasts on his horn to inform the soldiers he had arrived before pulling his cab up at the side of the road. The inspector jumped down from the cab and strolled purposefully toward the opening. The soldiers, having heard the truck's horn, began filing out of the trees with Drew close behind them. The first load is here, the inspector informed them as they appeared. Could you all step out of the trees for a moment to allow the truck down there safely? The men all shifted out of the way, and the truck, under John's skilled piloting, began to slowly edge backwards through the trees. Blimey, you weren't joking when you said it was thin, John exclaimed to the inspector through his window as he passed, but he doggedly reversed his way down the path, the men following slowly. They had made a good start at clearing the trees, but as he travelled deeper into their branches, the familiar piercing sound of branch on metal erupted again. This time it seemed to have more vigour, as if the trees knew what was happening and would stop at nothing to prevent the truck leaving its load. The truck, however, was unstoppable, and despite a few slips as the tyres struggled to find their grip, it made it to the dip without issue. The paint that had marked the location of the body still remained, though a little faded and beginning to be covered by leaves. The men gathered about the truck as John activated the control in his cab that caused the flatbed at the rear of the truck to rise, and as it did, the earth slipped rather gracefully from it and onto the ground, creating a large, neat pile. The flatbed was then returned to its normal position, and the inspector jumped back into the cab with John. As they pulled away, the inspector asked him to stop near Drew. "You're doing great work here. Dr. Sampson will be down later with some colleagues to begin working their way through the soil. Have them fill the dip with the soil they no longer want, and gradually we will have it filled in," he instructed. "Yes, Inspector, will do. See you later." "Yes, the Green Man at 1 o'clock for lunch if I don't see you sooner." The inspector tipped his hat at the men, and the truck made its way out of the trees and back toward the mound. When the inspector returned with the emptied truck, he was surprised to see that all work had ceased. A small pile of earth had appeared where he had requested, but the digger stood motionless, its claw hanging lifelessly in the air. The men stood about the mound, anxiously awaiting the inspector's return. The inspector, immediately sensing that something had happened and fearing the worst, jumped out of the truck as it reversed up towards the mound, easily outmanoeuvring it and getting there quicker. When he arrived at the scene, his mind was put to rest as he could immediately see why the men had stopped. Protruding upward through the mud, tall and proud, stood the peak of a huge rock monolith. All about it the earth was still piled high. It was only slightly shorter than the mound had been at its tallest. The inspector estimated its height to be at least 30 feet, with most of it still being hidden in the mound. The soldiers were obviously amazed to see it. They stood gawping, unsure of what to do next. "My word," the inspector gasped loudly, running to the mound to inspect it closer. "Good work, Jensen, not a scratch," he called to the driver, who put a hand up in recognition of his efforts. The inspector carefully walked as close to the revealed stone as the mound would allow in the wet mud. The rock still had a thin layer of dirt that remained from its burial, but the persistent rain slowly washed it away, revealing a shimmering grey surface. For a moment the inspector, like the soldiers, was too awestruck by the sight of it to know what to do. It was too regular in shape and in too strange a place to have gotten there naturally. It was clear that it had been carved by men, moved there by men, and then, for whatever reason, hidden by men. The inspector considered for a moment, gathering his thoughts before he began directing the soldiers. "Well, it would appear we have found what we are looking for," he informed them. "We still need to have the entire site cleared, though. Who knows, there may even be more rocks hidden away in the remaining soil." The men began gathering round him. "I think, for now, the safest way forward would be to clear the soil with spades and add to the pile over by the truck, which we can use the digger to fill." The men all nodded, and soon they were all digging away at the soil. After an hour of digging, they were joined by Dr. Sampson again. "Inspector!" he gasped, awestruck when he saw what they had discovered. "This is incredible." "Yes, it is rather marvellous, isn't it?" he replied. "Tell me, what do you think it is?" "Do you mind if I get a closer look?" he asked. Dr. Sampson sped carefully over the mud and made his way up to the stone. The men that had been on the mound working lent him a hand to help him up. "Fascinating. It seems to be a rock similar to that used at Arbor, not far from here," he called down. "Arbor," the inspector asked from the base of the mound. "What's that?" "It's the remains of an ancient stone circle in the Peak District," Dr. Sampson replied. "These stones are still standing, though. There's a dome on top of this one. Fascinating. That suggests there could be more stones in here, you know." "Yes, that's what I thought. I'm hoping we will find some others hidden in there somewhere." "Well, I'm quite amazed," Dr. Sampson admitted. He glanced around suddenly as if remembering something. "Where's the rest of the soil? It could be filled with artifacts," he asked excitedly. "It has been moved to the site where I believe it was removed from originally. I was hoping you and your colleagues would be happy to set up camp there, as things are getting a little overcrowded here. You are, of course, welcome to come and watch the progress." "Splendid. They should be arriving shortly, providing they can find the place, of course. Firestone Copse doesn't lend itself to being easily found," he informed him. "I must have driven past the turning several times before eventually getting here." The inspector smiled. "With the discovery of this rock, I have a feeling this town is about to become a well-known destination for historians and sightseers alike. It is about to become a lot easier to find," the inspector said. "When are your colleagues joining you?" "They should be here within the hour. They are bringing some tents to shelter under and some more equipment. I bought some in my car, but had no idea there would be so much work." Dr. Sampson's eyes had barely left the rock. He was in complete awe of such a major discovery. "Well, you are welcome to wait here with us. I'm sure you would like to watch the digging process to see if any other rocks are discovered." "Oh, rather," he enthused excitedly. "Any chance of joining in? I have a spade in my car." "Of course, the more the merrier," the inspector replied encouragingly. The archaeologist rushed off to fetch his equipment. The digging continued with spades. The men carefully tossed the soil onto the ground where it was slowly moved into a heap near the truck. Dr. Sampson quickly returned. climbing back onto the mound and starting his work around the first stone. The soldiers helped him back up and began helping him dig. Before long, Dr. Sampson could be heard shouting fervently, "Here! Ah! Another one!" Once again, all work stopped as everyone approached the scene to witness the second stone being revealed. Dr. Sampson found it approximately 5 feet away from the first, standing just as tall. Now all the men began helping around the 2 rocks, and after another hour of hard work both were half exposed. As the men dug, the rest of the archaeologists arrived, approaching the remains of the mound dumbfounded at the discovery. When Dr. Sampson saw them arrive, he jumped down from the mound and ran up to them. As they walked up to the stones, he briefed them frantically on the situation. The soldiers gave them some space, allowing them to study the rocks closely. Dr. Sampson's colleagues were middle-aged men in old boots and scruffy trousers. They were wrapped up warmly against the cold in worn-out coats that fitted the men rather comfortably. They were bespectacled and had smiles that only archaeologists could have at the prospect of sifting through mounds of old mud. One of them began taking pictures, at which point the inspector interjected. "Gentlemen, I fully appreciate the need for recording the moment, and as such could I request to develop your films for you and take copies for my investigation?" the inspector asked friendlily. He needed to check the photographs in case they revealed anything lurking between the trees, but he saw no reason to reveal his ulterior motives. "Well, that's a very kind offer, thank you," they nodded. "You're welcome. Give me your films as you finish them." "Of course. Well then, we have a lot of work to do, don't we, gentlemen?" Dr. Sampson asked them, and then continued excitedly without giving them a chance to answer. "I'll show them round, then if it suits you we'd like to make our way to the other site," he requested. "Of course, we need as much information as you think you might be able to give us." The inspector made his way over to the stones with the archaeologists. "What would you like to know?" Dr. Sampson asked. "Well, how long do you think the stones have been there? Why were they buried? Could there be any more buried in the area? And if so, where might we expect to find them?" the inspector asked. The archaeologists had a collective scratch of their individual heads. "We'll need to sift through some of the soil to try and answer all those properly," one of the older men replied, "and study the stones themselves, but if these are like some of the others that we have dotted about the area of this size, then the rocks have been here about 5,000 years, he told him. The inspector nodded. "Perhaps some of you could stay here and help us with any further discoveries," the inspector suggested. "Yes, that's a good idea," Dr. Sampson agreed. "As to your question regarding where to dig for more stones," another of his colleagues spoke up, "although the obvious searching point for now needs to be the remaining soil here, I'd also suspect that you might find some stones in amongst the trees. These relics often have avenues of smaller stones leading to them. You may find some remnants of them in the trees." "Yes, of course, good thinking, Charles," Dr. Sampson nodded in agreement. "Look, gentlemen, the afternoon is nearly upon us," the inspector informed them, feeling the wind pick up a little. "Why don't we show you to the site where the soil has been taken, and you can make a start?" "Yes, okay. Charles and I will stay here. You chaps go down to the site and start setting up. We'll swap over later." "Very well," a bearded chap agreed for the others. "Wonderful. I will come down with John in the truck. I can catch up with the others then and learn about how the clearance is going. Follow us. It isn't far," the inspector instructed them. "We'll see you all later then," Dr. Sampson called after them as they hurried in the inspector's footsteps. "Yes, see you later, Roddy." They waved goodbye and returned to their cars while the inspector disturbed John, who was sitting in his cab reading a paper listening to the radio. He folded it away as the inspector climbed back in and they drove out of the site. As the policeman removed the blue tape for them to exit, they noticed more people gathering at the road. Word had obviously gotten around that something big was happening. On arrival at the site of the path clearance, things were quieter than at the mound. None of the townsfolk had noticed the commotion that the quiet clearing in the woods had attracted. The men had cut and cleared almost the entire path, the sound from their chainsaws ricocheting around the trees clumsily. The men required little attention. They were quite happy to continue with their task unsupervised, which pleased Drew, as he was able to allow them to do what they had been ordered to do and occasionally lend a hand. He soon became distracted though, finding himself staring into the trees, and wondered if somewhere between them one or both of the missing men were watching him. John parked the truck on the side of the road again, the archaeologists pulling up behind him in their Volvo Amazon. John gave a couple of blasts on his horn, and soldiers exited the path up to the clearing to allow him to reverse up safely. When the soil had been deposited and the truck was safely out of the way, the archaeologists carefully drove through the trees. The path was clearer now. A definite track through the trees had been carved. The inspector joined the archaeologists at the site and watched as they began to set up their things. They had 2 large shelters under which they set up folding tables, and on these they optimistically placed large blue plastic tubs for their finds. They then began to process the mud, carrying it by the bucketful up to the tables where the unenviable work began. As if by habit, the inspector removed his camera and began taking pictures. The scene was so unlike his first visit here. That occasion had been sombre and had a sense of finality about it. The atmosphere was now charged and exciting at the prospect of change. Drew approached him muddied and tired but optimistic. "Strange to see so much life here after Sunday night," he observed to the inspector, who nodded. I was just contemplating the same thing, he agreed. We were beginning to make some headway to a solution, Drew. I'm sure of it. Drew smiled, thinking of Casey's words the night before. The inspector wasn't there to find out what had happened, but to stop it from happening again. Well, now our friends seem to have settled themselves into their task, I say we make our way back over to what remains of the mound. I suspect they'll all be wanting their lunch. He checked his watch. The time had just passed 12. Gentlemen, he called to the archaeologists, who were already covered in mud. They looked up at the inspector. Lunch at the Green Man in town from 1 till 2 if you're interested, he informed them. They nodded in thanks and eagerly got back to their work. Drew, perhaps you'd like to ride in the truck with me, he suggested, and they made their way back to John in his cab and then headed back to the stones. As the truck approached the side of the path through the trees towards the stones, the constable standing guard ushered the small crowd to one side for safety, then removed the blue tape across the opening. John, with the utmost skill as he had demonstrated whenever he was behind the wheel of the large vehicle, positioned the truck carefully across the road and began reversing down the path, checking his side mirrors as he did to ensure he was making safe passage. The inspector also looked in the mirrors, marvelling at John's careful work, when his attention was suddenly distracted by the pair of monoliths protruding into the air. They were more pronounced than earlier, standing proud amongst the piles of dirt that once hid them. As the truck approached the stones, the inspector noticed something about them that he couldn't fathom, and it took every ounce of his self-control not to react to it. Moving eerily between the stone pillars, connected them and connected by them, was an iridescent film that shimmered like an oil spill or the surface of a soap bubble. It shone dimly, an eerie glow emanating from it, which was barely visible under the dull grey sun. As soon as the truck had stopped, the inspector leapt down from the cab to face the stone to study it, wondering why no one else was marvelling at it. When he faced the stones, however, he found that the film had vanished. Downhearted and confused, he slowly climbed back into the cab and slammed the door shut, baffled. John watched him climb back in, then grabbed his paper and carried on where he left off. The inspector looked again in the mirror, and to his amazement, the iridescence had returned. He quickly removed his camera from his case and took some photographs of its reflection in John's mirror, much to John's confusion. He then climbed out of the cab again and began taking pictures of the stones. He also removed from his bag his instruments and began taking readings rather frantically. Drew had exited the cab, and on seeing the stones for the first time, his jaw had dropped in astonishment. He could do nothing more than stand in wonder and watch the inspector going about his investigation. His movements also caught the attention of the others working at the site, and realising that he was being watched, he stood up on a mound of nearby earth to address the men. "Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your hard work this morning." Those that hadn't stopped already turned to face him. "I think you all deserve a break, so why don't you all head off to the pub for lunch?" The men happily downed tools and made their way out of the area to the bus. "John, why don't you leave your truck there and get a lift in the bus with the others?" he called to him. John jumped down without hesitation and fished out his keys. "No need to lock it," the inspector assured him with a trusting smile. John shrugged and followed the others out of the woods. The inspector stood thanking those that passed him on their way, waiting for the area to clear. "Well, you are right about there being something in the mud," Drew congratulated him. "Yes, wasn't quite expecting this, though," the inspector informed him. "You might as well head off to the pub as well, Drew. I'll meet you there. Go ahead and tuck in," the inspector advised him when all the others had gone. "If you're sure, Inspector," Drew asked. "Oh yes, thank you. The walk into town will do me good." Drew nodded and made his way after the men, wondering what the inspector was up to. The inspector waited a moment for Drew to make his way out of the area before continuing to take his readings and jotting down his findings. He took more pictures of the stones and jumped back into the cab and watched the strange shimmering carefully for a while. A theory began to form in his mind, and with it came a plan of action. He jumped down from the truck's cab again and hurried out of the copse, his destination set. Chapter 76. In the front room of the vicarage, Aldous dozed lightly in his armchair. The cat had forsaken its spot by the fire, and had instead taken residence on his lap, curled up and fast asleep. Aldous had spent a tiring morning in the back garden of the vicarage, continuing the hard work that the soldiers had begun in clearing the graveyard. His rusty shears had made the work harder than he had imagined, and now with lunch eaten he was taking a well-deserved rest. The cat purred lightly in his sleep. Suddenly, the rest was disturbed by 3 loud bangs at the door. They both jumped awake, Aldous rubbing his head while the cat pounced casually and elegantly back onto the floor. "Oh my, we must have dropped off, Samuel," Aldous addressed the indifferent cat, who began cleaning himself. Aldous rushed to the door to see who it might be. "Oh, Inspector, what a nice surprise." Aldous welcomed him in with a warm smile when he saw who was behind the door. "I had a visit from a friend of yours earlier, the archaeologist. What was his name?" "Dr. Sampson," the inspector replied. "Oh yes, nice chap. He wanted to use my telephone." He scratched his sleepy head. "May I ask why there are excited archaeologists descending on Firestone Copse?" the vicar said. "You can, and I will answer your questions, but first I'm afraid I must ask to use your telephone as well." My, I should start charging, Aldous joked. The inspector thought for a moment. I am happy to pay. I do apologise for the inconvenience. It's just yours is the closest phone to the site. The site of what? Aldous asked excitedly. In a moment, Aldous, in a moment. The inspector hurried to the telephone and lifted the receiver. He began entering a long series of numbers. Well, I'll get the kettle on, shall I? Aldous suggested, suspecting the inspector wished to keep the telephone call private, and he plodded sleepily through to the kitchen. The inspector waited as patiently as he could for his call to be answered, but the truth was that he was short of time and eager for the line to be picked up. Rank, number and position, please, the man's voice asked as soon as the call was answered. Inspector 99473, Scotland Yard, case 4199. I'm in Firestone, and I need to report a 111. The man at the end of the phone paused for a moment. Just confirm that for us, please. What are you reporting? A 111, the inspector replied, and I need to do it quickly, as I believe there may be a chance I could exit through the 111. The line went quiet. The operator seemed to reel for a moment, though the inspector, of course, could not be sure. Judging from previous reports, that would be inadvisable, the man explained. Please give justification. I understand your misgivings. Following from my earlier experience, I believe if I had sufficient protection and correctly aligned field manipulators, I could enter, and this time perhaps make contact with the potential 347. Go on, the operator urged him. The inspector wondered who else was listening in on the call, and decided to give the full details behind his theory. It appears that the energy I was detecting was being blocked, and it was this blockage that caused the bodies to appear. The energy would build up to a certain level, and then it would burst, sending a charge through space-time, much like an electrical charge for a lightning strike. It would grab whatever poor person it happened to strike from whatever random place and time they happened to be in, and drag them to Firestone. None survived, and it was this moment through the 111 that gave the bodies their distinctive cause of death. I wouldn't swear to it, but I imagine if I were to find where they were snatched from, we would find the missing flesh that was cut from the centre of their bodies. With the removal of the blockage, the energy is no longer building up, so the cause of the appearance of the bodies has been stopped. My theory is that the missing men have entered the 111. However, if the energy dissipates completely, the men will be lost inside. I may have solved one problem, but the missing men have created a new one. What of the 347? The voice asked. I believe the 347 used the 111 to travel between places before it became blocked. When the mound blocked the energy, it also blocked its way in and out. Actually, there is every chance that there are more 347s, the inspector added. Now that the blockage has gone, they should be able to use it again to, he thought for a moment, exit the trees and return to wherever it is they have come from. The inspector could hear the operator's pencil scribbling. Hold, please, he said, and the line went dead. The inspector held his breath and waited impatiently. Inspector? The voice returned after what seemed like an eternity. Yes, the inspector asked eagerly. I have confirmation that you are to proceed with your plan, came the reply. Good. In that case, I will require a suit. Another loaded silence. I can't give you authority to go ahead with that. Hold, please. The line clicked and whirred again while he was transferred. The line was answered quickly again. Suit control. Good afternoon, Inspector. Good afternoon. I'm trying to gain access to a suit. When? The man asked. Tonight would be good, the inspector told him hopefully. He heard suit control looking through some papers. Use of suit has been authorised. It will be delivered to the Stones at midnight tonight. You have it for 6 hours. Suit will be collected at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning from the same position. The inspector could not help but smile at the news, despite the extreme danger he had placed himself in. Understood, though I am unsure of how long I will be gone for, or where I might end up after my visit, so I can't guarantee I will be able to have it back for you at the collection point at that time. In these cases, an indicator has been fitted that can be activated on your return. It will act as a beacon, and the courier will be able to track you to the new location, the man informed him. Marvellous. I'd hate for it to be left outside for too long. The inspector thought of the inquisitive locals at the sight of the mound. I will report in as soon as the suit is activated, as per the protocol. A full report will be expected on your return, the operator told him. Yes, I understand, the inspector nodded. Anything else, the voice asked. Yes, I will also require another field enhancer. I'm afraid the first one was destroyed on Wednesday night. Of course, I'll let them know. It will be with the suit control assured him. Thank you, the inspector replied. That is all for now. He hung up the telephone and paused for a moment, pondering his actions, contemplating the next 24 hours of his life and where they would lead him. He then turned and walked to the kitchen. Through the window he could see Aldous in the garden, and he walked through to speak to him. Ah, Inspector! Aldous placed his shears down and picked up a cup of tea from the ground nearby and passed it to him, hand-gloved in green-stained white cotton. "All well, I hope?" he asked, referring to the telephone conversation. "I hope so too. We shall soon see," the inspector replied, taking a grateful swig. "I see you've been working hard out here," he pointed out. Well, I was put slightly to shame when the lads from the barracks cleared most of it. I hadn't realised how bad it had gotten, so I thought I should make the effort. The grounds had expanded significantly, the old tomb now a prominent feature. We should really get Bill up here to have a look. I'm sure he'd be interested, the inspector mentioned, nodding toward the dilapidated structure. Yes, I'm sure, the vicar replied, noticing the inspector seemed distracted but not wanting to pry. What plans have you today? He asked, making conversation. I shall be heading down to the Green Mound shortly for lunch with the men. I'm hoping Dr. Sampson and his colleagues will be there to fill me in on their progress. Then back to the mound to continue the clearance, and this evening... He trailed off, wondering again just what would become of him that night. Well, I guess we shall have to wait and see.